Let's begin, Eric, with you and the question that I raised. How does PepsiCo basically decide how to allocate resources to its social objectives and whether you should do it by funding NGO work or changing the business model? And how, in either way, do you work with partners?
Well, thanks, President Clinton. I think the answer to all these complex issues obviously starts off by saying we have to do both. We need to use philanthropy dollars in ways in which you can address usually market failures, things like building capacity of people, innovation around ideas and knowledge, and even addressing emergency relief issues that come up all the time. But I think the greater movement that we're seeing is towards ensuring that we embed within the structure of our business the importance of addressing health, environmental, diversity, and social issues, and finding ways to both cost it into the daily reality of business. And we have projects where we are trying to do that as we speak.
For example?
Well, one, particularly close to many of our hearts because it's been a journey of a year, started when the Prime Minister of Ethiopia reached out to the World Food Programme with a real problem. And the problem was growing hunger in the Horn of Africa, and his desire to make sure that the solution wasn't just a short-term handout, which would be a classic approach of philanthropy, but address some of the core issues around building agricultural productivity in a country with huge potential, but which has seen tragically drought and famine. And the project therefore came from a very real need and started with discussions with the World Food Programme, where we recognized that supporting them through our foundation to develop nutritionally important products to address the immediate needs was a good step, but not the only step. We had to work with the local agricultural community in Ethiopia, USAID, and the local farmers, particularly the smallholder farmers, to see whether we could increase productivity. The good news, President Clinton, is that I have in my hand the results of the first year's work, which I'll put on here for people to see. And the small chickpeas are the ones that are currently grown traditionally. The large ones are the result of one season's work on doing something to you that sounds very simple: planting chickpeas in rows and using better seed. Those two simple interventions, which our agro-scientists with farmers in Ethiopia led, have doubled the yields of chickpea in one season. Now, that may not sound particularly exciting until you realize that there are about 100, 200, maybe 300,000 farmers who grow them every year in Ethiopia. And as Raj Shah recently said, the head of USAID, if you're really interested in poverty, you need to start by boosting agricultural productivity. And we think the spin-off effects of being able to demonstrate this initially with the farmers you saw will have an enormous impact. So we see that the philanthropic dollars are critical because there isn't a need today. You can't expect business to solve the emergency needs today. But to look at the long-term issues, we could be finding ways in which the productivity and the increased chickpeas would find their ways into our business, and hopefully you enjoy hummus, and hopefully you enjoy sabra hummus. And potentially, the sesame from that, by the way, already comes predominantly from Ethiopia, and maybe in time, these increased chickpea productivity will find their ways into the brands, showing that it'll be good for the business, and of course it's good for society. And through the partnership, it's giving us a lot of confidence of how we could work with players we don't work with, the US government, the World Food Programme, the government of Ethiopia. And one last comment, I think one of the unexpected enormous impacts of the project is on our own staff and the morale of our staff. We have taken this project into our cafeteria, into our laboratories to let our scientists, let our sales, marketing people understand what a company can do if it takes its core capability in agro and marketing. The enthusiasm is enormous, and I suspect that the companies of the future who are going to do well are those who are going to attract the best talent. And the best talent of young people today aren't only interested in the size of their paycheck, which obviously is important, but how they're also contributing to society.
Thank you. It's great. Now, first of all, I like this because chickpeas are on my diet. And secondly, you know, we have hundreds of people working in Ethiopia on healthcare projects. But here's an example of what I hope you're thinking about. If you know anything about Ethiopia, and you know it's near Somalia, Djibouti, northern Kenya, it's part of the Horn of Africa, so there's a famine there all the time. The famine begins in eastern Ethiopia. The crops are grown west of Addis, by and large. So here's something you should be thinking about. The next step is not only to increase agricultural productivity, but to develop cooperative storage and marketing and distribution systems. The last time I was in Ethiopia about, 3 or 4 years ago, they had a more minor famine that year. They had a bumper crop. They had more than they needed for the people who were in the areas where the crops were grown. They didn't have a distribution and storage system. So out there is maybe somebody who could have a new partnership with PepsiCo. Bobbi, let's talk a little bit about the GAPS approach to integrating community investment with the company's core business. How do you do it, and how does the PACE Commitment Partnership fit into that? Tell people what it is and how it works.
Okay, great. Thank you, President Clinton. So what I wanted to do is share a little bit about how we think about integrating our work in the community and society into our core business. And I'm going to tell it through the story of PACE. And we primarily, for every investment that we make in the community, use two fundamental principles. The first is that we want to leverage our company assets, including cash, but beyond cash. And then we want to do this thing called create a virtuous cycle. So how do we make sure that all the stakeholders who are investing in this social change get something out of it? And that, we believe, is a way to drive sustainability. So it's really those two core principles of leveraging our company assets, cash plus, and then how do we create this virtuous cycle so that all the stakeholders who are trying to create that change continue to participate. So the story of PACE, and let me tell you a little bit about what PACE is. It stands for Personal Advancement and Career Enhancement, and it's a program for female garment workers and providing them with education. It's about an 80-hour training course in work and life skills. And I think this is a very illustrative about how we leverage our company assets. So about 6 years ago, as a company, we were re-looking at our community investments, and for the developed world, we quickly landed on youth because we had been investing in youth for many, many years and decided we were going to continue to do that with a focus on teenagers. And we originally thought, wouldn't it be great to have one target around the world? But as we turned to the developing world, we realized that if you wanted to change the life of a young person, you really had to change the life of a woman. And so we turned our direction toward impacting women in the developing world. But we asked ourselves, what could we do? And it became clear that education, just like in any other part of the world, was really a critical element in potentially changing the life of a woman. But as an apparel retailer, we said, well, what assets do we actually have that could impact women in education in the developing world? And what we realized is that 80% of garments are made by women. So there's a great likelihood that every single one of us in this room today has on something that was made by a woman. And it also meant that garment factories were a great place to teach women because there were so many in one place. And we happen to have relationships with garment factory owners. We don't own any of our own factories, but we have those relationships. So we said that's a great use of a company asset. We could put our cash into the program, but what's more powerful is leveraging these relationships that we had. So that's where the whole virtuous cycle piece comes in. So when we patched this idea, we had to get partners. And the first partner we called was the International Center for Research on Women. And I know that CGI is very familiar with ICRW. And they helped us build our strategy, as well as made sure that we were building something we could measure. so that we can make sure that we were actually changing lives. We then made a decision that our first country was going to be India. And we found this small nonprofit based out of Bangalore. We wanted to make sure the implementing partner was local. They helped us not only implement the program, but they were really the chief architects of building the curriculum. And then we had to pick a factory and say, okay, who's going to partner with us? And we picked one of our largest partners in India, Shahi Exports. And the four of us collaborated together, bringing all of our distinct skills to the table to build a program that made sense for the women and also made sense for business. So here are the results of the virtuous cycle, and I'm going to give you examples from India because they're the ones where we have the most robust data. But for the woman, what we found is that through this program, she saw herself as more effective. So she said, my actions actually result in some positive outcome. She felt she was more effective at work, that her voice mattered in the workplace. She also had greater financial literacy, so she had a savings account. More women had savings account and less debt. And I think the real kicker here is that women who went through the PACE program were being promoted at 3.5 times the rate of women not in the program. So that's what she got out of being in PACE. But what about the factory owner? Because the factory owner had to participate in this. What they saw was lower absenteeism without notice. They saw higher efficiency, higher productivity, and they were very pleased with the results that they were seeing from a business standpoint. And then the other key stakeholder in making this whole virtuous cycle happen was the family. Because women in the developing world do not have the kind of freedom we do here in the developed world. And so her family really had to give her permission to participate. And the way we built PACE was that the women had to give 60% of their personal time, and then the company would give 40% of paid time. But the families had to give up some of that personal time. And so when we started the program, we kick off every module of learning with what's called a Mahita Mela. And it's a 5-hour, both a celebration and a kickoff of the topic. But it happens on a Sunday. And so the women have to take time away from family. So what we do is at the end of the class, we send them home with a packet of food for the Sunday meal. Because she might have stayed home that day to cook, but in this case, the family was able to part with her, and then she brought home a meal. But they also saw that she was contributing a voice to the family that they didn't hear before. And so they were listening to her more. And she was more part of the decision-making at home. And then obviously, as she moved up the ladder at work, that she was bringing home more income. So that's how the virtuous cycle works, and that's how we used our company assets beyond cash to make a difference for women in the developing world.
What benefit do you think the company got out of it? What benefit did GAP get out of it?
I think the benefits are multiple-fold. I mean, I think that, first of all, the garment industry is getting more complex. So, you know, as we, as consumers, demand for more sophisticated product, that we need workers who can read and write, who can operate a computer. So you need more skills in order to do that. Obviously, the efficiency, productivity, but as someone, you know, who buys apparel from factories, we really look at a multitude of things when we place product in factories. The speed, the innovation, the flexibility. So there are many things. It's not just, you know, can you make a t-shirt, but it's how you make it. The other thing, you know, Derek referenced this at Pepsi as well, not to underestimate employee pride and why people join your company. And having this work being done in a way that people see that my business, my industry is making a difference in lives and not just here to make stuff and sell stuff. And I think that that is extremely powerful.
Thank you. Now we're going to talk to two members of the non-governmental and non-corporate world, the NGO world, about their partnerships. I want to start with them, Sanjayan, the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. And you can tell by looking at him, he's associated with the University of Montana, which is a great testimony to the growing diversity of the United States and why we should get off this nutty anti-immigration kick. That's just a side footnote. But I began working with the Nature Conservancy more than 30 years ago when I was a governor, because they would advance funds to states when their legislators weren't meeting to buy about to disappear priceless natural resources. And I think I used them more than almost any other governor in the country for a decade. They were incredibly instrumental in preserving some of the most important natural resources of my native state. But they operate all around the world, and they do really profoundly important things. So I'd like for you to talk about what kind of partners that you have and why you got them and what they do in your efforts to conserve water in Latin America. And first, to maybe state the obvious, tell them why you think water conservation in Latin America is important, and then why you needed partners to do what you're doing.
Sure. Thank you, President Clinton, and good afternoon to all of you. All of you know the issues about water, and particularly how it impacts people. 3 billion people live in water basins where water scarcity is a really big issue. And it's throughout the globe. It impacts women and children profoundly. So, you know, we've started as a land trust. That's what the Nature Conservancy used to do, you know, go out and buy land. But as we start working, particularly outside the US, but also in the US, we realized that the way we are going to make a change at a scale that's important to the planet is by connecting our mission to people's lives, to the real issues that matter to people on an everyday basis. So last year I was in Latin America, and if I get the next slide here, I was in a little town called Puerto Lopez in Ecuador. And you know, there's 100 little shops all serving ceviche and cerveza. And I went in there, and I sat down and ordered some lunch. And the proprietress came out, and this is her name is Margarita. True story, real name, Margarita. So Margarita comes out, and I ask her a simple question. I say, hey, what's the hardest thing about running your small business? And I thought she would say fish, or customers, or getting a right cook. But I was stunned at what she said. She said, agua. Agua, water, really? She says, come back, and she takes me back to her kitchen. And there's a tap, it's wide open. Underneath the tap is a pink plastic bucket, waiting for that minor miracle that happens once a week when water actually flows. She doesn't know when it's going to come. It might show up every week. Now, how does she actually get water? She gets water because she pays some guy 25 bucks to go down to a borehole, pump water, and bring it to her in a truck. Now, if you just go a couple hundred miles to the city, to the capital, Quito, Ecuador, and you open a tap, you get plenty of water there. Now, why do you get water in Quito? Well, it turns out that the residents of Quito created a water fund, basically a bank for water. So it's a trust fund, they pay into it, and that money basically goes to protect the Condor Biosphere Reserve, which is a big forest that has things like the Andean bear and the condor and things that, you know, people like myself care about. But by making that small payment to basically Quechua indigenous communities, they're assuring themselves that water is going to continue to flow to their city year in and year out. Now, this was a small idea, and the Nature Conservancy helped implement this idea, but we sat on it. It's kind of a cool story. We could tell it. We sat on it. And then, once we got involved with CGI, with the Clinton Global Initiative, what ended up happening is it started taking our game to a whole nother level. We were introduced basically to partners, and we were urged to think about this as a commitment. So what the Conservancy ended up doing, making a long story short, is taking a really big gulp moment and saying, all right, here's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and set aside 7 million acres of important watersheds throughout Latin America, 7 million acres, in order to provide water for 50 million people. And we're going to commit $32 million to making that happen. I think it's about $30 million to making that happen. Now, we couldn't do this alone. And two partners who stepped up right away were the Inter-American Development Bank and FEMSA. Now, FEMSA turns out to be the big bottling company. Now, they're like one of the biggest bottlers, and they go out and bottle stuff for Coca-Cola and others. Now, why were they interested? Well, they're interested because having clean water is imperative to their business. Sustainability for them equals availability. And so for us, that partnership that was created through CGI and allowed us to elevate our game, come up with unlikely partners, and then set up a commitment that now we feel pressure to live up to. Otherwise, you're going to have us up on stage and tell us why we didn't get there.
This is a huge issue. About 1 billion people have no access to clean water. And that's a lot of people in a world of even with 7 billion. But beyond that, a lot of people have it, but don't have it in practical amounts. That is enough necessary to preserve family health, much less conduct elemental agriculture. So most of the places that I work around the world, I worry about the loss of topsoil. And it's related to the preservation of resources, including water, but there are a phenomenal number of places where this water problem is staggering. And in addition to that, there are a lot of places that have water that is impure. That's really the Haiti cholera story. No water systems, no purification systems, and there are enormous numbers of people involved in one piece or another of this, and there's a lot of very compelling and not very expensive technology to purify water. So where are you going with this, and how many partners do you need? What are the most important things that other people can do that you can't?
That's a great question. So the challenge with water, it turns out that everyone focuses on taps, hardware, dams, levees, wells, and so on and so forth, and that's really important. But at the end of the day, people sort of forget. Actually, if you go out on the street and ask someone, where does water come from, they're going to tell you the tap. It's like the 77% of Americans respond that way. But sort of people forget that ultimately, the ultimate source of water is nature. And if you really want to think about water, you have to think about it forests all the way to faucets. Now, we're the Nature Conservancy. We don't do things like creating new technologies for filtration systems. But we do understand that ultimate water security starts with the watershed. And that's a place that we can put a lot of effort in with corporate partners, but also with public sector partners and other NGOs in order to make sure that the supply is there and the cleanliness is there, which will reduce the need for all the other hardware, which always, always breaks down over time. I mean, that's the great thing about forests get just better with time, cleaning water up and providing water. Everything else, you have to continually put inputs in to making it happen. So you need the whole chain, from forests all the way to faucets. And we're now just starting to explore a little bit of trying to do this in Haiti, which the need is huge, obviously. And it's always been this clean it at the point of contact. And we're going to try and think a little more holistically and think 20 years. It's not going to happen in 1 year. It's going to take a decade or two.
Ashley, in your work with PSI, tell us a little bit about how you've tried to create a model that can be, I think you call it social franchising, but one that can be replicated. It's a huge problem for all of us. We all go someplace and do something. We think, wow, that's wonderful. Pretty soon it'll be everywhere, and it doesn't get there. So you've done a lot of work on this and dealing with poor communities and dealing with the big problems like diarrhea and malaria, and also the basic issue of preserving family health. So how did you develop this model, and who helped you? Who are your partners?
Well, thank you for having me, President Clinton. And just before I go into some of that, which is really interesting for me, I do want to say that I have a spiritual practice, and my service work really comes from that, and I have found it necessary to really sustain it, or else the work is too depleting, because it can be very sad for all the innovation there is in the world and all the amazing, dedicated people doing transformative work at the grassroots level. There is a lot of tragedy. So I was speaking with a friend of mine who also does speaking in venues like this, and I said, so how do you prepare? How do you pray? And he said, what my prayer is just to get out of the way, and I say to God, if you need me to look like an idiot so that someone can hear what they need to hear, please help me be willing to look like an idiot. And I said, well, that's fine, but not in front of this crowd. And I think I've already done that, because I know what kind of memory you have, and I think I'm the only person ever to have interrupted you. So I humiliated myself before I even started. Well, first of all, I'd like to build on what Bobbi was saying, because when she was talking about the more skilled a worker can be, the greater they can meet a corporation's consumer goods output. And I would say that in this era of incredible trends facilitated by social media, that the industrial outworker, the woman who's in the informal economy, if she can transition very quickly from making the trend from January to the trend from March so that you can get it into your shop on the high street faster and beat your competitor, that is an asset to your corporation. And then the other thing I wanted to say about what you presented was, I saw a garment factory, and in Southeast Asia, Population Services International, on whose board I serve, has workplace programs in those garment factories, because essentially for a long work day, we have a captive audience of vulnerable girls and women who desperately need to hear modern family planning messaging, malaria symptom recognition and treatment-seeking behaviors, how to be less vulnerable to labor and sexual exploitation. And it's done oftentimes at lunch, where there's a period of rest and relaxation. They're getting a nutritious meal. That can be supplied by the NGO partner if the garment factory operator is not willing to do that. And a lot of times it's done through art and music and dance, so there's a sense of levity. That's a wonderful way to communicate education and behavior change. And I was the juror once for an art contest in which women were expressing what they had learned. So they took in the information and they were able to then outwardly express what their uptake was. So anyone who has industrial areas or large workforce populations, PSI is very happy to partner with you, and it's something we do extremely well. And I think it's great to be up here with people from Gap and Pepsi, because we do a lot of what President Clinton referred to as social marketing, and I think as a board at PSI, we kind of want to change that word because it's known in our space, but health franchising probably makes more sense to the layperson. And I'm going to tell some personal stories about some folks I've met, because really what it's about is people. And I've had the opportunity to go to 13 countries, some of them multiple times, but Congo is a place that's pretty difficult for me to get out of my system. And there was one woman I met whom I called Mama Teresa. She's a very exceptional individual, because Congo obviously is a very, well, that's Victor and Teresa and their family, and I'll talk about them in a minute, but Mama Teresa was so extraordinary because she was the daughter of educators. And her husband was an orphan, but his uncle who took him in was also a teacher. And together, they didn't have access to family planning, so they had a larger family than they could care for properly. They had 8 children, but they managed to send every single one of them to school. And I'm telling you, in Congo, that is nothing short of a miracle. When the Belge left, there were 18 Congolese with university degrees. And yet this family had chronic episodes of diarrheal disease from unsafe drinking water. They had persistent bouts of malaria. And as I said, they loved all of their children. They cared for them as best they could, but they knew that they did not have sufficient resources to allocate to each of their children's optimal welfare. And Victor and Teresa here, they've been married for 30 years. He absolutely adores his wife. He looks at her the way, I mean, he was just precious. He had this bum eye, but he'd still look at her all the time. And her hair was tinted orange for malnutrition, and these are some of their children. She had 9 pregnancies total, 3 of which ended in really botched herbal-induced abortions because she just knew that they couldn't care for any more babies. And they too had episodes of diarrheal disease and malaria and pneumonia and all that stuff. And how we were able to reach both of these families is through leveraging existing entrepreneurs in the grassroots community, identifying in one particular case a pair of brothers who were selling mobile phones and minute cards. So PSI outreach workers visited with them, thought they were really bright, really dynamic, they were gregarious kids, and gave them technical training on point-of-use water purification solution, which is a product that is manufactured by Procter & Gamble, and asked them if they would like to brand their kiosk with the pure, which is what it's called and marketed as in Congo, solution. We did a large public demonstration in a very crowded marketplace. It was one of the most colorful scenes, and we attracted a lot of attention. It was all done orally. It's very appropriate for non-literate populations. We took, filthy, putrid water, did the demonstration. I would shout out, someone would translate what the process was, and it was a call and answer, sort of like we would have been familiar with in churches when there weren't enough hymnals, and it was called lining in the South. And at the end, we all had a delicious glass of water. And we make that product available at a highly subsidized price to the brothers, who then make a small profit on it. Now, the families that were exposed to this education, whether or not they bought the solution that day, went home and they had a story to tell. And that's really what we're getting at. The conversation, the very visceral demonstration that this product is applicable to our health and wellness on a daily basis, it becoming a social norm, and then is a practice that's passed on through the generations. So that's an example of health franchising through an existing entrepreneur. So it's leveraging the infrastructure, however modest. And another quick example is to address family planning. You might look at a place like Myanmar, where there's an enormous unmet need for modern contraceptives, and right now PSI, through health franchising, is meeting about 25% of that country's family planning need, women of reproductive age. And we did that by identifying healthcare providers and giving them very expanded technical training and expertise. We've given them a basket of products that we procure internationally, family planning tools like IUD, and with the training for the insertion, injectables, pills. We also do we're the largest procurer of long-lasting insecticide-treated nets in the world, and sexually transmitted infection management. And then we do quality assurance checkups. We brand them. It's called the Sun Health franchise, so it becomes very recognizable in the community, very colorful. But we didn't stop there. We went into the more rural outposts and trained community health workers with this exact same methodology. And thus, a woman, if she comes to her community health worker or the health care provider for one thing, she is now able to access integrated health service and product delivery.
Let me ask you something. Did the governments of Congo and Myanmar support what you were doing? Did they give you permission to do it? Or did you just go and they were so disorganized they couldn't stop you?
Well, we have platforms in almost 70 countries, and the answer probably runs the spectrum. We take our government friendliness and cooperation very seriously. We do consider ourselves to be guests. However, the majority of our staff are local, which is another way that we build capacity, because we're contributing to the intellectual and human growth of our communities in that way. And whenever I travel, I'm always meeting with the ministers of health and the regional ministers. Wanda is a great example. They rely heavily on PSI, which is now locally incorporated and is the direction in which all of our platforms are moving, to meet a very large percentage of their country's health needs. And that is a country that's famously engaged in its population's well-being, and fewer than 2% of the population in Rwanda has access to piped water. So it's still very severe. And another program that we have there is called 12 Plus, where we as an NGO partnered with the Nike Foundation, because girls of that pre-adolescent age are a very underserved and vulnerable demographic. So we have modules where we invite them to these wonderful youth drop-in centers where they can play and just be kids and be safe, and they get lessons on financial literacy, some job skill training, they get lessons about delay of sexual debut, how and why to avoid transactional or cross-generational sex, as well as just information about puberty. And those are just a few examples, and we've got a wonderful group up here, so I'm going to be quiet.
No, but go ahead. But the thing I want you to just make one more comment on is there a discernible difference when you're operating in a country with a low income but a essentially well-organized, well-disciplined government like Rwanda, which welcomed you in, and one where, well, it's different. And as you pointed out, it's a little bit different everywhere, but Rwanda's, they're very well organized, and I think they do the best job of any country I work with in Africa of making maximum use of NGOs because it's part of a seamless strategy. Do you agree with that?
I do. President Kagame is very well aware of the limitations of what they can do with their population, and he very gratefully relies on NGOs. I really can't pretend to answer that question with great authority. I would have to defer to our country representatives. I will say that in places like Cambodia and Thailand, Madagascar, Kenya, India, pretty much everywhere I have personally been, we have outstanding relationships with the governments, and they're grateful for the help. Some of the pictures that were shown a minute ago were of Kinshasa General Hospital, and it was before the Belge left where Europeans and other wealthy people from the whole of sub-Saharan Africa sought their health care. Now it's a condemned building. The infrastructure is either non-existent or the public health system is extremely fragmented and overburdened. There's a real lack of confidence amongst the consumers, the population, and so it's really up to the private sector to find these partnerships and points of insertions into the community to help build health, which is the building block of all sustainability.
Derek, when I was listening to you talk about the chickpeas in Ethiopia, what can Pepsi do? What should Pepsi do? Or who should Pepsi hand off to replicate this model elsewhere? This is something that could be done in 100 places. And we have tremendous nutritional problems all across the world.
Yeah, I think President Clinton, we can't underestimate the power of first like-thinking companies starting to work together, but particularly, and it goes back to your last question, where governments, and particularly the head of state, shows a very clear and deliberate goal of saying, we want to create the environment in which companies can do what they do best, which tends to be related to getting efficient delivery in place, building agricultural systems, productivity. But if government isn't willing to make it friendly to companies to operate, it becomes very difficult. The good news for Africa is that there's now a consortium of companies which include a range from the seed, whether it's Monsanto, Syngenta, John Deere, Yara on the fertilizer side, ourselves, Unilever, all the way through, working in 7 or 8 key countries. And each one of those countries, the head of state has signed on to a commitment to say, we really want to either create investment zones where we encourage the private sector to come in, or we actually are changing our incentive structures, or we're going to put up the development finance with the development banks. I think we see that when everybody starts playing their role around a common plan, which has to be a country-owned plan, companies are more likely to come to the table. Our little story about Ethiopia really just shows that the potential to go from currently the problem of Africa in agriculture is that it's growing, just to think of one number, about 1 ton per hectare of food is being produced. In Asia, it's about 3 to 4 tons. In the Midwest, it'll be 8 to 10 tons. So there's a huge gap. And remember that the African continent has probably got 60% of the least cultivated land on the planet. When we start looking to the future, the size and the scale of the need of meeting the needs of 9 billion people to ensure that they are going to be fed by the 2050s will take a colossal effort by all of these companies, the governments, and I know many of you in the audience, whether it's engagement from the water side, whether it's from the agricultural science side, all the way through to what Ashley was saying. A lot of the problems relate to the failure of good quality marketing. And of course, bringing in good quality marketing, particularly to market some of the healthier new options, becomes really critical. So those companies become important. You also mentioned, President Clinton earlier, the issue of storage. One of the things people are unaware of is the fact that between 30 and maybe even 50% of the food that is grown in Africa is wasted from the time it grows to the time it gets to somebody. And that is something which could be fixed relatively simply by either taking processing to where it can happen in the field, simple methods of better storage, and a range of fairly simple technologies that we take for granted in many of the developed countries, whether it's simple packaging and barriers and so on. If we did that, think what happens when you actually reduce waste by 30 to 50%. Of course, it adds value to the farmer, but it also means that you have to use less land at a time when land is coming under greater and greater pressure. And I'm sure Sanjayan will be able to tell us a little bit more about how we're only going to meet our goals of reducing hunger if we start intensifying the way we actually do some of our agricultural practices, and particularly use our water resources more effectively.
Well, thank you. The reason I ask you that is more or less out of frustration and default, my foundation started farming operations in Rwanda and Malawi, where we went to do healthcare work. And every farmer we worked with at a minimum tripled his or her income. And basically what we did, besides getting them better fertilizer and seeds at lower cost, is take the food to market without taking half the profit away, and develop elemental storage and distribution systems. And so essentially, one of the things I've learned is, I'll never forget the first time I went out to a place where we were going to reopen a hospital in Rwanda that had been closed since the genocide. And I met with these farmers. They brought all these farmers to see me. So we started digging around in the soil, and he said, a lot of strange Americans have come here. You're the first one that ever dug in the dirt. And I told him I didn't know any better. He just had to humor me. But the thing that I wanted to say is that they took good care of the soil. They're not dumb. They are capable of producing much higher yields. They don't have to be put to work in a factory farm. They don't have to have their government sell the farmland to somebody else to earn a crop. They need the kind of thing that American farmers had in the 30s with the Agricultural Extension Service and basic storage and marketing. It's not rocket science. And I think it's really important because they also are very much more likely to embrace water conservation technologies in harvesting, in my opinion. And I think that's going to be really important. And some of that will take some serious money once we decide to get into saving the water.
If I could just add to that, I think one of the most interesting, we ended up meeting with USAID, the World Food Program, meeting the Prime Minister of Ethiopia at the start of the project. The first question to me, this is the Prime Minister, was how do you feel about the biofertilizer potential of chickpeas? Luckily, I had been briefed that he was a knowledgeable farmer. It's basically reminding us that that's putting nitrogen in the soil, which enriches the quality of the soil. But I think, President Clinton, at the heart of the programs that we're interested in lies a fundamental shift in the way we actually look at poor farmers in Africa as being aid recipients as opposed to entrepreneurs of the future. And that switch from being aid recipients to encouraging and supporting farmers to be entrepreneurs requires simple skills, simple technology, and I would say a cell phone. Armed with a cell phone, we have seen in the remote parts of Ethiopia farmers with cell phones on one hand using a 15th century scythe in the other to cut the teff or the wheat, showing that the two technologies are not yet in sync. But the farmers in Africa who are being equipped by the cell phone companies with cell phones now know the price in the market of the product. They can time things better. They know the rainfall that's likely. They can actually target their watering. They can actually start getting the latest advice about where to get seeds. And don't underestimate the power of the fact that we now have 500-600 million cell phone users across Africa. When that starts linking them better to markets, I think we can start seeing an acceleration in the potential of the continent.
President Clinton, one of the things that really surprises me about this group, public companies, private companies, nonprofits, government institutions, is the ability for these partnerships to form to help grow businesses, be more sustainable, help people, and help the planet. And one of the things that surprises me is that so many people come to CGI, make commitments, and then end up actually keeping those commitments. Now, we hear all the time companies make promises about what they're going to do. We hear governments do this all the time. We're going up to Rio +20, and you know they're all going to go show up there, and they're all going to make commitments about how they're going to save the planet. And it doesn't really come to pass. So I guess I would pose one small question to you because of this audience here. Why do you think so many of the commitments that CGI helps foster end up being met?
Well, first of all, I think when you make a commitment, you already have a pretty good idea of how you can keep it. That is, if you think about, it's one of my big beefs with government everywhere. If you run a national government and you say, I endorse the Millennium Development Goals, think how much of the work of meeting those goals has to be done a very long way from the capital city by public and private and NGO actors whom you may or may not have any influence over and may or may not know how to affect. I mean, one of my big beefs on this whole climate debate is we don't spend enough time doing projects that prove it's good economics to change the way you produce and consume energy if you do it in the right way. If we did that, we'd be living in a different world. Let's take a little elemental simple thing. When the president got an agreement with the auto companies, the auto workers, and all the major environmental groups to dramatically raise the car mileage standards. One little thing, right? The changing technologies are not going to bankrupt America. They're going to create 150,000 new jobs. And they will be sustainable making these higher mileage cars. I could give you 1,000 other examples. I think that's the problem. When the Kyoto Accord was signed, and then we were all babes in the woods. Now, America didn't go along with it. We did it. We helped to draft it, and then the Senate voted against it 95-0 before Al Gore got off the airplane, I think, from Japan. I always say that's the only bill I ever lost before I sent it to the Congress. But in fairness, they were still in the grip of a bad idea, which is that no country can get rich, stay rich, and get richer without putting more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And they were right about point 2, which is nobody had a clue about how they would do this. So in the period where the Kyoto regime expires this year, a lot of countries have beaten their Kyoto goal and a lot haven't. And they've done it in all kinds of different ways. But the ones who did it had governments, normally they were smaller countries, who could drill down into it and figure out how to do it. I mean, one of the reasons I organized CGI and tried to encourage these partnerships is so people could actually talk about how the heck we're going to do this stuff. I really believe that's the problem. I just think that national governments are used to dealing at a level of abstraction where they don't deal with the how questions enough. Now, in some areas, they can be quite effective, particularly if they have more homogeneous systems. And I don't necessarily mean races. I mean people that are used to working in a highly cooperative way. So if you look at the Finnish education system, for example, where 100% of the teachers graduate in the top third of their class, and there are 10 applications for every teaching class open. And they have students from 41 countries. It's an increasingly diverse country. But there are only 5 million people there. So I think that's one of the things Brazil is probably doing the best job of any really large country in answering a lot of these how questions on the environment. But now they've got two terrible dilemmas. One is they want more hydropower because it's clean, and the only place they can get the rivers is out of the rainforest, which they don't want to tear down. The other is they're now in their 4th or 5th year when they use more biofuels than gasoline in their cars. and they have the best biofuel in the world. The cane-based ethanol is 9.3 gallons of ethanol for every gallon of oil. And they don't use rainforest. But the more the deep topsoil the cane takes, the more they push the soybean farmers and the cattle ranchers into the rainforest. So but if you ask my opinion, is one of the reasons I started this whole thing is I don't think governments think enough about how to do things, or if they know things are being done, how to take them to scale. Which is why I believe, to go back to our friends from corporate America, to the extent that a company can both have a social mission and have it integrated into its business model, it is then more likely to be copied by other businesses and more likely to generate government policies that will give people incentives to do the same thing. I don't think any of the people that signed the Kyoto Accord thought they were lying. They had every intention of doing it. They just figured out they didn't know how to do it, or they didn't know how to move the levers. That's why I asked Ashley if she was welcomed by the governments of the places she went. A lot of these governments really do learn a lot by working with the NGOs, and they build their own capacity. You mentioned the problems in Rwanda. They just, it was amazing. They just agreed to work with 19 representatives of 19 different American medical schools to try to build a truly national health system from top to bottom down to the poorest, smallest villages. I don't know if we're going to be able to do it or not, but it's a heroic effort for a country at their level of per capita income. That's the sort of thing we need to be thinking about in every one of these areas. So my question is, do you have any plans, and what are they, to go to places where the water shortage is more severe and likely to grow much more severe in the years ahead and affect far more people?
So the issue of water funds clearly works well in certain areas, and one of the challenges we have is really measuring the social impact and the environmental impact of the work we do so we can learn from it to gear it for other places. We're now taking it to Africa, but there are a couple of things that make water funds work better. You need great partners. Pepsi, we're working with them, Coca-Cola, FEMSA, and others. Sometimes having big institutional partners can help put that first dollar on the table to get the trust fund started. You need a gradient. You need actual slope, right? So that people who get the water can look up and go, oh, I get it. It's coming from up there. So there are some limitations. It doesn't work everywhere. But in other places, to me, the trick has always been about trying to figure out what it is that people are getting from the environment, and it's being underpriced, and then figuring out a way to value it in such a way that it makes it locally relevant, so that locally people start valuing it at a different way. So, in Egypt, for example, looking at the Nile and looking at how it floods, how flooding agriculture works, how dams are going to affect it, really help with water security. In other places, it just might be water conservation. It might be technology that helps do it. In the Flint River here in Georgia, we introduced technology that reduces how much a farmer takes out of that river by 17%. Now, this is in the same year that the mayor of Atlanta is praying for rain. There's something that's actually working on the ground, making a difference. So you're always going to have to modify. One size won't necessarily fit all. The key thing is to figure out how people use nature, how to value that, and how to create local valuation that allows them to then accept it and bring it into their system so they can protect it in the long run.
Bobbi, you said something that, in your comments, you talked about how you tried to use the lunch hour in these factories to reach the women. And you said that you got an NGO partner to give them a nutritious lunch if their employer didn't do it. So my question to you is, what are your plans? How many different manufacturers supply the gap? Do you know?
Lots. Yeah, it's in.
Do you have a strategy for getting them all involved? And is there some way we could get other companies that have in your line of work to reach them? Because I think that's really key. If you look at all the problems of social fracturing we read about in China, usually it's some contract manufacturer and what happens to the employees and what happens to the resources, is the water being polluted or whatever in the town. I think this relationship between big multinational companies and their local manufacturing operations that are not a part of the company is going to be one of the pivotal questions that will affect not just women and girls, but to a great extent, the welfare of women and girls for a long time.
Yes, and I think that's a really great question. And when we created the idea of PACE, we really created it as a replication model because we knew as one company in a very large industry that we weren't going to be the only agents of change or could be. So the basic model that we designed was that it was a 3-year prove the business case. So we sat down with the factory owner and said, look, in 3 years we will prove to you that this is good for your business. But then at that point, you have got to take on the cost of running this program, and then we want to take our funds and move to another factory. So when we started this program in India, and the first vendor that we worked with, they do a lot of social programs, so they were keen on partnering with us, but you could tell they were kind of like, okay, you got to prove it to me. So I went back to India 6 months after the program launched, and the head of HR was in the meeting, and he said, do not give this program to anyone else. He said, we see this as a competitive advantage. He said, we understand now what this can really do. And he said, we have a 20% vacancy rate when it comes to supervisory positions, and many of those positions are filled with men. And if they can open that pipeline by having qualified women to take those jobs, they were starting to do the math in their head of what that really meant. They've also done the math on productivity, and it makes a lot of sense to them as well. So here we started with 2 factory locations, 250 women in each class. They are now in 10 factories. They have made a public pledge that by 2020, all 60,000 of their employees will go through the PACE program. So we think that that is a very positive thing. But to answer your question about, so then where do we go from there? So we are now by the end of this year, we'll be in 7 countries. This month, about 7,500 women will have gone through the program. Through our learnings, we've built what we call a PACE toolkit, or PACE in a box, that takes the curriculum, but it also has built in a quality assurance packet that says if you are to implement PACE on your own without us, this is what good looks like. And then ICRW helped us build an evaluation framework so that we measure things in a way that we can compare them. And then we just signed on to a database, I think it's called Nudia, and it's a place where we can have the factories now load their data so we can see, sitting in San Francisco, how's everyone doing, how are the women progressing. We're getting better at capturing all the data, I think we're getting smarter as we go, but this, I think, is the first step to really replicating this idea, and then we'll have to take it from there and see how we can impact the industry as a whole.
Thanks. I won't ask you whether you would willingly share it with all your competitors, but someday we'll all have to do that. I mean, it's a big deal. We're out of time, but I want to close by asking Ashley a question about PSI and the portion of their programs that basically require behavior change. I don't know about you, but the older I get, the harder it is to do that. And if you look at America's 2 big health challenges, childhood obesity, which is my biggest domestic project with our foundation, and the aging of the baby boomers, if we use healthcare just at the same rate that our predecessors did, we can bankrupt the healthcare system. So we need behavior change on both ends of the population scale in America in some very profound ways, in addition to continued efforts to reform the health system. This is going to be a huge deal around the world. And it goes to a lot of other things. There was a stunning article in the New York Times today. I urge you all to read this. saying how perplexed some Americans in Afghanistan were, that the Afghans were more angry about the inadvertent burning of the Quran than the killing of the civilians, and that you could atone for the killing of the civilians by paying recompense to the families in a way that you couldn't. Anyway, it just proved how different the worldviews of our two peoples are. So, how important is behavior change? How do you do it? How hard is it to do? And how much does it require some kind of local partner to affect from country to country, culture to culture?
Well, it's a great question, and I appreciate it. And I'll pluck from things that everyone has said, because at PSI, we measure our impact the way your company measures your profits. You count dollars. We count the number of years of healthy life that we add to an individual. So you're counting dollars. We count something called dailies, a disability-adjusted life year. We're obsessed with measuring. We operate in a very corporate culture as an NGO. And I was very pleased to hear the International Center for Research on Women mentioned a couple of times by Bonnie. I'm on their advisory council, and they really help formulate a lot of the measurement tools. So treating recipients as entrepreneurs instead of as aid recipients. We look at the totality of the market, and right now the public sector is highly subsidized and somewhat flooded, and they don't have the capacity to do the distribution. So we look at the private sector for these deliverances. And branding is one of the ways that we do it, and this is where I'm getting to the behavior change. So when we think of a brand, we have an expectation that every time we interface with that particular brand, there will be a standard of quality and product and service, and that it will, and this fits into health, it will be affordable, accessible, acceptable, and quality, and that's called the AAAQ. So it's always been fairly easy to capture and quantify the health impact, and we present that to our donors, governments, foundations. And recently, we've wanted to try to capture the behavior change, and it's a little more messy. It's a little more unruly. So we would love your marketing minds to help contribute to that. We know how to motivate the behavior change, but reflecting that change is a little harder. And some of the ways that we do it is just really wonderful grassroots interactions. So a play breaks out in the middle of a slum in Humura in Nairobi, and there's a narrative that is expressed through this play, and the throng that has gathered, they see potential outcomes from this conflict, and they choose the one that would be happier for their family. And then they go home and they've got this to think about, and the next time they're presented with that particular dynamic, they know that they have choices in their own behavior. It's very simple things like paintings on the sides of walls and buildings. We use a lot of radio, we use television where it's available, and there's a lot of interpersonal communication amongst peers. So like talking to like. An example of that takes place in some of the youth centers that we operate around the world. We're one of the only organizations in the world that will work with injecting drug users. And we have some drop-in centers specifically for them in places like Thailand and Cambodia. And when people feel safe, they can be vulnerable and thus more open to talking about what they really do and tell the truth. And when they can hear a different course of behavior from someone who has found greater self-efficacy through that behavior change, then they themselves can try it. And I hope those are some good examples.
Let's give them a hand. Weren't they great? That's great. Thank you. Well, I've kept you a little late, but I hope we have persuaded you, number one, that this is an integral part of a happy life, doing this kind of work, and a productive life. And number two, that since a lot of these problems are quite challenging, the partnerships and the networks work better inherently because no person, no NGO, no great corporation can know everything, be everywhere, have all the skills, have all the tools. And that's why more and more and more we're trying to drive CGI to make partnerships with people like our panelists. So let's give them one more hand and go on to your sessions. Thank you very much.